The scent of burning firewood filled the compound as Amaka pounded yam in the wooden mortar, her hands moving rhythmically, yet her heart was anything but steady. Her mother, Mama Nkechi, stood beside her, rolling hot balls of yam into smooth mounds, humming a song that felt too joyful for the moment. Amaka had always loved that tune, but today the melody grated against her soul. It felt like a cruel mockery of the fate that awaited her. A loud cough from her father's side of the hut made her stomach tighten. Papa had not spoken much since returning from his meeting with the elders. His silence weighed heavier than his words ever could. Amaka had known something was wrong the moment he avoided her eyes during dinner, the way he mumbled his blessings and quickly retreated to his room. Today she would learn why. "Amaka," Papa called finally, his voice grave. He stepped out of the hut, his weathered face somber, his eyes dimmed by the burden of a decision already made. "Come inside, we need to talk." She wiped her hands on her wrapper and followed him, her heartbeat pounding like a talking drum in her chest. The air in the room was thick, as though the walls themselves held their breath. She sat on the wooden stool, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "My daughter," Papa began, staring at the floor instead of her face. "We have received an offer for your hand in marriage." The room spun, her hands clenched into fists. Marriage? No, this couldn't be happening. She was only 22. She had dreams of finishing her teacher training, of helping children in the village learn how to read, of seeing the world beyond their small town in Enugu. "Mama, Papa," she whispered, shaking her head. "I don't want to get married now." "It is not about what you want," Mama Nkechi cut in, her voice softer but just as firm. "It is about what is best for the family." Amaka's breath hitched. "Who is it?" she asked, though a dreadful feeling already coiled in her stomach. Papa sighed deeply. "Obinna." The name alone made her flinch. Everyone in the village knew of Obinna Ozuomena, the wealthy cocoa tycoon who lived in the grand mansion on the outskirts of the village. He was once a proud and powerful man, but since his accident that left him unable to walk, he had become bitter and cruel. No one spoke of him with warmth, servants feared him, and even business associates treaded carefully around him. But why?" Amaka's voice was barely above a whisper. "He is much older than me, and he is not kind." Papa sighed. "He has wealth, my daughter. Wealth that will ensure your future and that of your siblings. You know how hard things have been since the drought ruined last season's harvest? We are in debt, Amaka. If we refuse this offer, we may lose everything." Tears burned behind her eyes. It was true. The past few months had been unbearable debts piling up, creditors whispering behind their backs, the shame of borrowing from neighbours. She had seen her mother weep in the night, heard her father's heavy sighs when he thought no one was listening, but marriage to a man like Obinna. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Papa, please. I don't love him. I don't even know him." "Love is for the fortunate," Mama Nkechi said, her face stern but sad. "Survival is for people like us." The words struck Amaka like a slap. Survival? Was this what her life had come to, being sold off like a piece of land to ensure her family's comfort? She looked to her father, searching his face for any sign of guilt, but he only looked tired, like a man who had no other choice. "The wedding is in 2 weeks," Papa said, finality in his tone. Amaka felt her breath leave her body. 2 weeks. Just like that, her life was no longer her own. She ran out of the hut, her chest heaving, her legs carrying her to the riverbank, where she had spent countless afternoons dreaming of a future that now seemed impossible. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the water, but she could not appreciate its beauty. Her hands clenched into fists. How could they do this to her? How could they throw her away like a pawn in their struggle for survival? Tears ran down her cheeks as she hugged herself tightly. Somewhere in the distance, a mother called out to her children. Laughter rang from a group of young girls collecting water, and life continued as if her own world had not just shattered into 1,000 pieces. For the first time in her life, Amaka felt truly helpless. And worse, truly alone. The sun burned high in the sky as Amaka sat silently in the back of the black Mercedes, watching familiar landscapes blur past her. She had left her family behind that morning, her mother's tearful embrace lingering like a ghost on her skin. Her father had not even looked at her when she climbed into the car, a silent acknowledgement that his duty as a father was done. Now she was being driven towards her new life, towards a man she had never loved, towards a fate she never chose. The journey to Obinna's estate felt endless. The car finally stopped in front of the imposing mansion, larger than she had ever imagined. The red-bricked walls stretched high, the iron gates towering over her like prison bars. As she stepped out, the oppressive silence sent shivers down her spine. A tall, elderly man, whom she assumed was the butler, opened the massive wooden doors, revealing a dimly lit hallway lined with portraits of Obinna's ancestors. The air smelled of old wood and something faintly bitter, perhaps loneliness itself. Her husband sat at the end of the hallway, his wheelchair positioned near the window, his sharp gaze fixed on her. He was younger than she expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, but there was a deep, permanent scowl on his face. His presence dominated the space, his anger radiating like an unspoken threat. "You're late," Obinna muttered, his voice like ice. Amaka swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her chains settle in. That night the mansion felt even colder than it looked. Amaka sat on the edge of the bed in the grand bedroom she was given, though it felt more like a gilded cage. Obinna had barely spoken to her after their first exchange, only giving orders to the butler before wheeling himself out of sight. There was no welcoming gesture, no kind words, only silence and the suffocating presence of her unwanted reality. She traced her fingers over the elaborate carvings on the mahogany headboard, wondering how many women had slept in this room before her. Had they been happy? Had they chosen to be here? The emptiness of the space gave her the answer she already knew. This was not a home, merely a place to exist. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The door creaked open, revealing a young maid with a nervous expression. "Madam, dinner is ready. The master requests your presence." Amaka hesitated before nodding. Whatever awaited her downstairs, she was certain of one thing. This marriage would not be an easy one. Amaka walked into the grand dining hall, her footsteps echoing against the cold marble floor. A long mahogany table stretched before her, set with an elaborate feast of steaming jollof rice, peppered fish, and roasted plantains. Yet, despite the richness of the meal, the atmosphere was barren. The only other person in the room was Obinna, seated at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. She hesitated before lowering herself into the chair a few seats away from him, her hands trembling as she reached for a spoon. The silence stretched unbearably, broken only by the occasional clink of metal against ceramic. Finally, she gathered the courage to speak. "Thank you for inviting me to dinner," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Obinna scoffed. "Inviting? You're my wife. You eat here now." His words stung. She lifted her gaze to meet his, searching for any warmth, any sign of the man he once was before the accident. But all she found was steel, an impenetrable fortress of bitterness. "I know you don't want me here," she said carefully, her fingers tightening around the edge of her plate, "but neither did I choose this." Obinna's hands stilled, his fork hovering mid-air. He exhaled sharply and placed it back down. "You think I enjoy this?" he asked, his tone laced with irritation. "You think I wanted a wife forced upon me by my family?" Amaka flinched at the harshness of his words, but she refused to cower. "I don't know what you wanted," she admitted, "but I do know that bitterness will not change our reality." Obinna's jaw tightened. He looked away, his fingers drumming against the table. For a moment, Amaka thought he might say something, but instantly. The morning passed in eerie silence, with the mansion's vast halls, feeling more like a mausoleum than a home. Amaka spent most of the day in her room, but she knew she couldn't hide forever. Summoning her courage, she decided to explore the estate, to understand the life she had unwillingly stepped into. She wandered down the long corridors lined with heavy portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The air carried the scent of polished wood and distant rain, an odd mixture of comfort and imprisonment. Servants bustled about, each avoiding her gaze as if acknowledging her presence was forbidden. It was as though she were a ghost in her own home. Eventually she found herself outside, stepping into the vast gardens that stretched beyond the house. The scent of hibiscus and wet earth filled the air, momentarily easing the tension in her chest. It was in this moment of peace that she heard the low murmur of voices near the stables. Curious, she approached carefully, stopping when she recognized one of the voices. It was Obinna's. "You think I care what they say?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the air. "Let them whisper. Let them call me a cripple behind my back. It changes nothing." Amaka peered around the corner, watching as he spoke to a man she didn't recognize, perhaps an old friend, or a business associate. The other man, dressed in a simple tunic, shifted uncomfortably. "It's not about what they say, Obinna. It's about what you're becoming. You push everyone away, even the ones who still care." Obinna's hands tightened on the wheels of his chair. "I don't need anyone's pity." Amaka's breath hitched. She understood now. His cruelty was a shield, a wall built high to keep the world from seeing the pain beneath. The next few days passed in a tense and uneasy truce. Amaka and Obinna barely spoke, only acknowledging each other in passing. She could sense his struggle, the battle between his instinct to push her away and the flickering curiosity in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Determined to break the suffocating silence, Amaka spent more time with the staff, particularly Chinyere, who had begun to open up to her. She learned about the inner workings of the estate, the routines that had been set in place long before her arrival, and most importantly, she listened. The servants spoke in hushed voices of Obinna's past, of the man he used to be, charming, ambitious, full of life, before the accident had robbed him of his pride and mobility. One afternoon, as Amaka walked through the library, she found a thick layer of dust covering the bookshelves. The room was beautiful but neglected, a relic of a forgotten past. She trailed her fingers along the spines of the books, pausing when she saw an old, leather-bound volume that looked well worn. Pulling it from the shelf, she opened it and found faded handwriting scrawled in the margins. "You shouldn't be in here." Obinna's voice startled her, and she turned to see him sitting in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I was just looking," she said, holding up the book. "Do you read much?" His eyes flickered to the book in her hands before he scoffed. "Not anymore." Amaka hesitated before stepping closer. "This book has notes in it. Did you write them?" Obinna clenched his jaw, wheeling himself into the room. "A long time ago. Would you like me to read it to you?" His eyes widened slightly as if surprised by her offer. Then just as quickly the walls went back up. "I don't need anyone to read to me," he snapped. Amaka met his gaze steadily. "I wasn't offering out of pity." Something shifted in his expression, something fragile and fleeting. But instead of answering, he turned his wheelchair and left the room. Amaka exhaled, staring down at the book in her hands. She had seen it again, that crack in his defenses, and she wasn't about to let it close. The library became Amaka's sanctuary in the days that followed. Each afternoon she would return, pulling books from the dusty shelves, flipping through pages filled with handwritten notes. Some bore business calculations, others sketches of architectural designs, and others, surprisingly, poetry. Obinna never entered the library again, but Amaka knew he was aware of her presence there. She often caught him watching her from a distance, his expression unreadable. The weight of unspoken words hung between them, heavy but not entirely unwelcome. One evening, as she sat curled in an armchair reading, a voice startled her. "You're persistent." She looked up to see Obinna in the doorway. His posture was stiff, but there was no malice in his tone. "I'm curious," she admitted, "about you." A ghost of a smirk crossed his lips. "There's nothing worth knowing." She closed the book in her lap. "That's not true." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, to her surprise, Obinna wheeled himself into the room and stopped beside the shelves. "I used to spend hours in here," he said, his voice quieter now. "Before the accident." Amaka hesitated before asking, "Why did you stop?" His fingers curled against the armrest of his wheelchair. "Because it reminded me of what I lost." She exhaled softly. "You haven't lost everything." Obinna let out a humorless chuckle. "Haven't I?" She wanted to argue, to tell him he was more than his injury, but she knew words alone wouldn't reach him. Instead, she reached for the book she had been reading, flipping to a page with handwritten notes. "Your words are still here," she said. "Who you were, who you are. It's all still here." For a moment she thought he might argue, but instead he simply looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. Then, without another word, he turned and wheeled himself away. Amaka sighed, pressing a hand to the pages of the book. The walls Obinna had built were high, but she wasn't done chipping away at them yet. The days that followed carried an unspoken shift. Though Obinna remained distant, the tension between them had lessened, replaced with something that felt almost like a fragile truce. Amaka noticed small changes, how he no longer left the room when she entered, how his sharp remarks softened into something less cutting, something almost thoughtful. One afternoon, while walking through the garden, Amaka found Obinna sitting in the courtyard, his wheelchair positioned under the shade of a large mango tree. He held a book in his lap, one of the many she had left open in the library, and his gaze was fixed on its pages. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. "You're reading," she said gently. Obinna glanced up, his expression unreadable. "I used to enjoy it." Amaka sat on the stone bench beside him, leaving a comfortable space between them. "Then why did you stop?" His fingers tightened around the book's spine. "Because I thought there was no point. What use is learning when everything you've worked for feels gone?" She studied him for a moment before speaking. "Maybe knowledge isn't just about progress. Maybe it's about remembering who you are." He didn't answer, but he didn't push her away either. Instead, he turned a page, his shoulders losing a fraction of their stiffness. A comfortable silence stretched between. The air inside the estate felt different that evening. It was heavier, charged with something Amaka couldn't quite place. The sky outside darkened, thick clouds rolling over the horizon like silent sentinels of an approaching storm. She had just finished setting aside the books in the library when she heard a crash from the hallway. Her heart leaped. She hurried towards the sound, her breath catching when she saw Obinna gripping the arms of his wheelchair, his face twisted in pain and frustration. A shattered glass lay on the floor beside him, the remnants of what had once been an expensive whiskey tumbler. His breathing was ragged, his hands trembling slightly. "Obinna," Amaka called cautiously. He didn't answer at first. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white against the chair's armrests. "Leave me," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer instead. "What happened?" His eyes flicked toward her, dark and full of something raw. "I dropped it," he said bitterly. "A simple glass, and I couldn't even pick it up." Amaka knelt, carefully gathering the shards in her hands. "It's just a glass, Obinna." "It's not just a glass," he snapped, his voice rising. "It's everything. I can't even do the simplest things without feeling weak." She paused, setting the shards aside before meeting his gaze. "You're not weak," she said firmly. "You're angry. And you're allowed to be. But you're not weak." His breathing slowed, though his expression remained unreadable. For the first time, he didn't push her words away. He simply sat there, letting them settle between them like the calm before a storm. Amaka exhaled and rose to her feet. "I'll bring you another glass," she said softly. "But I hope someday you see yourself the way I do." As she walked away, she could feel his gaze on her back. Something had shifted between them again, something deeper, and for the first time she felt that maybe, just maybe, he wanted to believe her. The rain came in heavy sheets that night, drumming against the windows of the estate. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within its walls. Amaka lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of Obinna's tormented face. His frustration, his pain, it was more than just physical. It was the weight of a life forever altered. A world that had turned against him. She turned on her side, listening to the thunder rumbling in the distance. A faint noise from the hallway drew her attention. Was it a servant? She hesitated before slipping out of bed, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders and stepping into the dimly lit corridor. At the far end of the hallway, she saw him. Obinna sat by the large window in his study, his back turned to her. The room was dim except for the flickering light of a single candle on the desk. He wasn't reading or writing, just staring out into the storm, lost in thought. Amaka hesitated. Turning away would be easier, leaving him to his solitude, to his suffering. But she wasn't that person. Not anymore. She stepped forward. You should rest. Obinna didn't react immediately, but after a moment he sighed. I don't sleep well when it rains. She moved closer, her gaze following his. Beyond the rain-streaked glass, the world was dark and restless. Why? He hesitated before answering. The night of my accident. There was a storm just like this. Amaka's heart clenched. She had heard rumors about that night, how he had been returning from a business trip. How his car? The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a fresh scent of damp earth and clean air. Amaka awoke feeling a strange sense of purpose, as if the previous night's conversation had shifted something within her as well. Obinna had let her in, if only a little, and she wasn't about to let that moment slip away. She made her way to the dining hall where breakfast had been set, but Obinna was not there. Chinyere, the young maid who had quickly become Amaka's only confidant, hurried over with a hesitant smile. The master is in the garden, she said, placing a tray of food before Amaka. Surprise flickered in Amaka's eyes. She had never seen Obinna outside voluntarily. Nodding, she set her fork down and rose to her feet, her curiosity outweighing the comfort of her morning meal. As she stepped outside, the golden sunlight bathed the estate's garden in warmth. Birds chirped in the distance, and the soft rustling of leaves filled the air. Then she saw him. Obinna sat under the same mango tree where she had found him reading days before. But this time he wasn't lost in his thoughts. He was watching the world around him, truly seeing it for the first time in a long while. You're up early, she said, approaching cautiously. Obinna smirked, but there was no bitterness in it this time. Couldn't sleep. Amaka settled onto the bench beside him. You seem different. He exhaled, his gaze fixed on a butterfly flitting between the flowers. I don't know, maybe I just realized something. She tilted her head. And what's that? That I've spent too long in the dark. He turned to her, the weight in his eyes still there, but lighter, as if he were beginning to accept something he had long resisted. Last night, for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel completely alone. Amaka felt her heart tighten at his words. She reached out, placing a gentle hand over his. You never were, Obinna. For once, he didn't pull away. The sun shone brighter that day, and for the first time, the walls of the estate didn't feel so confining. The healing had begun. The warmth of the sun lingered as Amaka and Obinna remained in the garden, neither speaking for a while. The silence between them no longer carried the weight of resentment, but something softer, something new. Amaka could see the shift in Obinna, not just in the way he looked at her, but in the way he looked at himself. I used to sit out here all the time, Obinna admitted, breaking the silence, before everything changed. Amaka turned to him, watching the way his fingers traced the wooden armrest of his wheelchair. You still can, she said gently. Nothing is stopping you. He let out a humorless chuckle. Nothing except my own mind, she considered his words before standing up. Then let's change that. Obinna frowned as she walked a few steps away and turned to face him. What are you doing? I want you to try, she said. To move beyond the places you confine yourself to. His jaw tightened. Amaka, I know it's hard, she cut in, her voice steady but full of encouragement. But you told me last night that you didn't feel alone, so let me be here for you now. Let me help. Obinna hesitated, his gaze flickering to the ground. The idea of change terrified him. He had spent so long in his pain, his isolation, that stepping outside of it felt impossible. But Amaka was right. He wasn't alone anymore. With a deep breath, he placed his hands on the wheels of his chair and pushed himself forward, just a few inches. The movement was small, but it was something. He lifted his gaze to Amaka, and she smiled, beaming with pride. There, she said. That's the first step. Obinna exhaled, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. Maybe you're right. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something more. The following days carried an air of quiet transformation. Though hesitant, Obinna continued pushing himself, both physically and emotionally. Amaka remained by his side, patient yet persistent, never pressuring but always encouraging. The walls he had, built so high around himself, were beginning to crack, and for the first time, he wasn't trying to rebuild them. One afternoon, Amaka found him in the library, a book open on his lap. He looked up as she entered, his expression contemplative. I forgot how much I used to love reading, he admitted. She smiled, taking a seat across from him. Then read to me. Obinna hesitated before clearing his throat and beginning. His voice, though rusty from disuse, carried a richness that filled the room. As he read, Amaka watched him, noting how his eyes softened, how the tension in his shoulders eased. This was the man he used to be, and with every passing day she saw more of him return. After a while he paused, closing the book. I can't believe I let myself lose this part of me. You're reclaiming it now, she said gently. That's what matters. Obinna exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. You really believe I can change? Amaka reached out, her fingers brushing against his. I don't just believe it, Obinna. I see it happening. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, something deeper passed between them. An understanding, an unspoken promise. Obinna wasn't just learning to move forward, he was learning to let Amaka in. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what that might mean. The sun filtered softly through the windows of the estate, casting golden patterns on the polished floors. The air was lighter, as if the house itself sensed the shift occurring within its walls. Amaka had never seen Obinna this way before, engaged, curious, even a little hopeful. He had spent the past few days not only reading but also sitting outside more often, watching the world with new eyes. One afternoon, as she arranged fresh flowers in the sitting room, she heard music drifting from the library, her brows furrowed in curiosity, and she followed the sound. Stepping inside, she found Obinna near the gramophone, an old record spinning slowly. I didn't know you liked music, she said, leaning against the doorframe. Obinna looked up with a small, almost sheepish smile. I used to, before. She walked towards him, swaying slightly to the rhythm. Dance with me. He blinked. Amaka, She held out a hand. No excuses, just this once. For a moment he hesitated, then exhaled and reached for her hand. With slow, careful movements, he guided his wheelchair as she moved in sync with him. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't conventional, but it was something. The music wrapped around them, and for a fleeting moment, they weren't two people bound by circumstance, but two souls moving towards something new. As the song faded, Obinna looked at her, his expression unreadable. Thank you. For what? She asked softly. For reminding me that life isn't over. Amaka squeezed his hand. It never was. And as they stood there wrapped in the quiet hum of possibility, neither of them could deny it. Change had come, and it was beautiful. The evening air carried the scent of rain, a soft breeze stirring the curtains of Amaka's room. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the dance she had shared with Obinna. Something inside her had shifted, something delicate, something hopeful. But with hope came fear. Could he truly let her in? Could she trust herself to stay? A gentle knock at the door startled her. She sat up, heart pounding slightly. "Come in." Obinna wheeled himself into the room, his expression uncertain. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I keep thinking about tonight." Amaka motioned for him to come closer, and he did, stopping just beside the edge of the bed. "What about it?" He exhaled. "I don't know how to do this." She frowned slightly. "Do what?" "This." He gestured vaguely between them. "Letting someone in. Letting myself feel. Again." Her heart ached for him, for the weight he carried. "You don't have to figure it all out at once," she said gently. "Just take it one step at a time." He studied her face for a long moment before nodding. "I'm trying." And in that moment, Amaka saw something different in his eyes. Not just the pain, but the willingness to move beyond it. It was a fragile thread, but it was there. And as long as it remained, she would hold on to it. She reached out, resting her hand lightly over his. That's all anyone can ask for. Obinna didn't pull away this time. Instead, he let his fingers curl slightly around hers, his grip tentative but real. As the night stretched on, they sat in silence, hands intertwined, the weight of the past slowly making room for something new. Morning light crept into the room, casting golden hues across the wooden floor. Amaka stirred, realizing she had fallen asleep in the chair by the window. She glanced toward the door, remembering the quiet moments she had shared with Obinna the night before. Something was shifting between them, delicate and uncertain, yet undeniable. It wasn't just the forced companionship of their circumstances anymore. There was something deeper, something real. Determined, Amaka made her way downstairs to the dining hall. She found Obinna already there, staring at his untouched cup of tea. His expression was unreadable, but when he noticed her, his posture relaxed slightly. "You're up early," he murmured. "So are you." She took a seat across from him, studying his face. "Did you sleep?" A small smirk played on his lips. "For a while." She nodded, deciding to tread carefully. "Obinna, have you ever thought about speaking to someone?" His jaw tightened. "You mean like a therapist?" "Yes," she said softly. "You've carried so much on your own for so long. Maybe it's time to let some of it go." His fingers tapped against the table. For a moment she thought he would dismiss the idea outright, but instead, he sighed. "I don't know if I can." "You don't have to do it alone," she assured him. "I'll be here every step of the way." Obinna met her gaze, something vulnerable flickering beneath his usual guarded exterior. He didn't answer immediately, but after a moment he gave a small nod. "Maybe," he whispered. "Maybe it's time." Amaka reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The past still loomed between them, but together they were beginning to unravel it. One fragile step at a time. The following days were filled with tentative conversations and stolen glances. Obinna was still guarded, but the rigid walls he had built were beginning to soften, brick by brick. Amaka remained patient, knowing that healing could not be rushed. One evening she found him in the study, staring at an old photograph in his hands. She stepped closer, her heart aching at the distant look in his eyes. "Who is that?" she asked gently. Obinna exhaled, turning the photograph toward her. It was of a young man standing beside an older gentleman. Obinna before the accident, his father beside him. There was pride in their expressions, a connection that now seemed lost. "My father," he murmured. "He had such high hopes for me." Amaka hesitated before speaking. "What happened between you two?" Obinna set the photograph down carefully. "After the accident, I was no longer the son he admired. He saw me as diminished. His voice was quiet, but the pain was unmistakable. I pushed him away before he could reject me first. Amaka reached out, placing her hand over his. Maybe he didn't see you that way, Obinna. Maybe that was your fear speaking, not his truth. He let out a dry chuckle. You think I should reach out? I think only you can decide that, she said. But carrying this pain alone isn't fair to you. Obinna sighed, his fingers grazing the edge of the photograph. I don't know if I'm ready. Amaka squeezed his hand. That's okay. You don't have to be ready today. Just don't close the door on the possibility. For a long moment he said nothing, but she could see the war in his eyes. Then, slowly, he nodded. It wasn't a promise, but it was a beginning, and that was enough for now. The next morning the air carried a quiet stillness. Obinna sat in the garden staring at his phone resting on the table in front of him. His fingers hovered over the screen, his mind warring with itself. Calling his father after all these years felt like attempting to open an old wound that had never fully healed. Amaka approached, carrying a tray of tea. She noticed the tension in his posture and set the tray down carefully before taking a seat beside him. You're thinking about it, aren't you? Obinna let out a dry chuckle, rubbing his temples. Thinking, doubting, over analyzing, take your pick. She poured him a cup of tea, her gaze steady. Fear has kept you from reaching out, but fear also keeps you from healing. What's the worst that could happen? He picked up the cup, but didn't drink, his fingers tapping lightly against the porcelain. What if he doesn't want to hear from me? What if he's moved on, and I'm just a painful reminder of what was lost? Amaka leaned forward. And what if he's been waiting for this moment? What if he regrets the distance as much as you do? Obinna inhaled deeply, his jaw tightening. He knew she was right. He had spent years burying himself in anger, using his father's perceived disappointment as another reason to shut out the world. But what if all of it had been in his head? After a long pause, he picked up the phone and dialed the number he hadn't used in years. His heart pounded as the line rang once, twice, then a voice answered. Obinna. The single word carried a mixture of shock, hesitation, and something else. Hope. Obinna swallowed, his throat tight. Papa, He exhaled sharply, gripping the phone tighter. I think we need to talk. Amaka watched him carefully, offering no words, only her quiet presence. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the vulnerability in his expression. And for the first time in a long time, Obinna wasn't carrying his burdens alone. It was only the beginning, but beginnings were enough. Obinna sat motionless, the phone pressed against his ear, his breath shallow. The familiar voice on the other end sent a rush of emotions through him, fear, relief, uncertainty. His father spoke again, softer this time. Obinna, is it really you? Obinna closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. Yes, Papa. It's me. A long silence stretched between them. The weight of the years of words left unsaid hung thick in the air. Amaka watched from her seat, her hands wrapped around her tea, offering silent support. I didn't think I'd ever hear your voice again, his father finally said, his tone a mixture of relief and sadness. So much time has passed. It has, Obinna admitted, his grip tightening on the phone. But I've been thinking about you, about everything, and I realize I might have been wrong. About a lot of things. His father exhaled heavily as if carrying a burden just as heavy as Obinna's. Son, I never stopped thinking about you. I wanted to reach out, but I feared you wouldn't want to hear from me. After the accident, you shut everyone out. I thought you blamed me. Obinna swallowed the lump in his throat. I blamed everyone, Papa, but mostly I blamed myself. And instead of facing things, I pushed everyone away. I don't want to do that anymore. There was another silence, but this time it was not filled with pain, it was filled with possibility. Then let's start again, his father said, voice thick with emotion. We don't have to fix everything in one call, but we can take the first step. Obinna nodded, even though his father couldn't see him. I'd like that. As he ended the call, a deep breath left his body as though he had been carrying the weight of that moment for years. He set the phone down and looked at Amaka, his expression lighter than she had ever seen it. "You did it," she said, her voice warm. "Yeah," he replied, a small, genuine smile forming. "I did." And for the first time in years, he felt something foreign yet welcome: hope. The sun rose over the estate, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. Obinna stood by the window, watching as the world slowly awakened. For the first time in a long while, he felt lighter, as if the burdens he had carried for years had begun to dissolve. Amaka entered the room, her presence warm and familiar. "How are you feeling?" He turned to face her, his expression unreadable but calm. "Different, like something inside me has shifted." She smiled, stepping closer. "That's because it has. You took a step forward, Obinna. That's no small thing." He nodded slowly. "I don't know what happens next, but I think I'm ready to find out." Amaka placed a reassuring hand on his. "You don't have to figure it out alone." For the first time, he truly believed her. Later that day, Obinna met with his staff in the courtyard. It had been months, perhaps years, since he had truly seen them, spoken to them as more than just employees. He acknowledged their hard work, their loyalty. There were murmurs of surprise, hesitant smiles, and then something unexpected: respect. As he rolled through the garden later, Amaka at his side, he took in the beauty he had long ignored. The flowers, the rustling leaves, the warmth of the sun. "Maybe it's time to start living again," he mused aloud. Amaka chuckled. "I think you've already begun." Obinna breathed deeply, feeling the truth in her words, and as the sun bathed them in its golden light, he knew this was just the beginning.